Grace and peace, beloved. It is great to be with you once again. It is a privilege and an honor to be with you once again, especially after that amazing kickoff of the book of Ruth that we had last week. Wasn't it awesome? It was an excellent introduction. Give it a hand to Pastor Tim, because I know we all appreciate him and everything that he does. But with that amazing kickoff, now we are ready to jump into chapter 1. And for the sake of clarity, we're going to read the first couple of verses. And of course, I'm going to repeat verse 1, even though we dug deep into that verse last week. We are going to include that in our initial reading. So let's go into verses 1 through 5, which reads as follows. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to reside in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. So they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay? That is the initial part of the book of Ruth. And the first thing we see in verse 1 is that, just as we saw last week, in the time of moral chaos and ignoring of the Torah, called the period of the judges, and as I gave in my humble commentary last week, one of the translations says, the time of the judging of the judges, right? So it is not only describing a chronological period, but also the nature of that period is that the judges, for which later on the people of Israel claimed for a king as the other nations. During this time, it was the judges, those leaders that would prop up. And we all know kind of the results. Those of you who have read the book of Judges, the result of that type of authority, what it brought. But this was the time, and there was a famine. And because of that famine, a man from the town of Bethlehem, which was the poster child of Israelite failure. It was the example of how to do things wrong, right? This man left the promised land to temporarily stay in the land of Moab, which was a place that was founded in incestuous seduction, and it was off limits to the people of God. Israel and Moab had a long history for years and years, and this was not a place where the Israelites should have gone to. And he left there with his wife and his 2 sons. Verse 2 shows us that the family had changed from simple sojourners into dwellers. They weren't just passing by Moab. They were actually remaining there, where they were camping there. They were living there. And they made Moab their home. Now, it's interesting that the book of Ruth has a lot of characters, and to look at the meanings of the names of those characters, it tells us something about not exactly what they're doing right now, but maybe what they were supposed to do. But in some instances, yes, it does describe kind of what their end was. So in this case, Elimelech means my God is king. When you see Hebrew, anywhere you see Eli, right? Eli is usually God, the name of God. Elohim, Eli. So you see Elimelech. As soon as you see that Eli, you need to say, okay, there's something about God here. And in this name, Elimelech means my God is king, which is ironic that he carried such a name because he's not really behaving as if God is his king. He's departing the land just because of a famine in the land. And many characters throughout the Bible live through a famine. They persist by the Lord's hand. But in this instance, this character said, this is not the place to be. Let's get out of here. So he carries an ironic name, right? If somebody that carries that name, you would expect them to behave as if God is their provider, is their king. But that's not what we see here. Now, Naomi's name means sweet, and it conveys this image of sweetness, of honey, sweet of nectar, and that's what Naomi means. Now, Malon actually means the sick one, which Pastor Tim puts here, sicko, right? He has a name of being sick, and he's probably, there are actually different commentaries. Some people believe that this was a kind of a nickname given to this character by the author of Ruth, and just gave him this name because of what happened later on. But there's different opinions on that. There are many examples in the Bible of people that carry horrible names in terms of, they gave him a name and they just carry it for life. So it could go either way, but in any case, that's what his name, given in the scriptures, what it means. It means a sick guy, sicko. And Helion means kind of like washed away, or in your notes it says done for. It's a guy done for. You're washed away. And also likely a nickname, but as you'll see later on, it kind of corresponds to his destiny, what happens later on to him. So they are Ephrathites, and Ephrathah was likely the local region in which Bethlehem at that time was located. Elimelech is presented at this point as the lead character. In every story, there's kind of like the main character, the protagonist, we say when we're talking about theater or movie. So Elimelech is presented as, this is the main guy, and this is what he did. But in verse 3, we see that Elimelech dies. What kind of main character is that? He died right at the beginning of the book. But then Naomi is left with 2 sons, right? So now the lead shifts. It's almost like the camera pans from Elimelech and now focuses on Naomi. And Naomi turns into the main character of our story. And from the standpoint of the narrative, Naomi remains as a central character of the story, even when the focus shifts to Ruth or Boaz later in the story. Naomi always has kind of a main role within this whole narrative. So Mr. Sicko and Mr. Dunfor, they take Moabite wives, which is quite shocking for an initial reader to see 2 Israelite young boys, probably inheritors of land and riches, and they go ahead and take Moabite wives in that land where they moved to. And it reflects back to kind of the temptation of the garden in Genesis, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when Eve is tempted in rebelliousness to God's direction not to eat from this, because God had already stated to the Israelites not to take women from the Moabites. Don't take women outside of the tribes. Remain pure. And we actually see that suggested in Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, which I'll read. I don't think you have it in your notes, but it says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the Lord's assembly. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, may ever enter the Lord's assembly." Now, this was a prohibition. We're not going to get deep into this, but it was a prohibition probably due to their practices, their religions, their idolatrous practices. So in any case, an Israelite knew very well they weren't supposed to do that, but these 2 characters go ahead and do exactly that. Now, they married 2 young ladies, one whose name is Orpah. Now, Orpah comes from the word that, in the Hebrew word that means neck, right? And we know in the ancient world, if you see the book of the Song of Songs of Solomon, it talks about your neck is like the Tower of David, So the neck of a woman represented beauty. But also could reflect kind of the sight of the back of her neck, as Orpah, as you'll see later on, Orpah actually walks away from the whole situation. And then maybe that was the name she carried because that's all you could see. You could see her neck walking away from the situation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ruth, there's a lot of commentaries on what the name of Ruth means. The nearest thing is that it means refresh or fertility or something fresh, something that is pleasing. So it says here that they lived in the land for 10 years. Now, a decade is not a period for a sojourn. It's not, you're traveling by a land and you stayed there 10 years. It really represents that you've planted yourself, you've established, you've started a family. 10 years is a number that reflects that permanence. So they're no longer temporarily residing in Moab. Their intention was to live there for generations and generations, to stay there. So then Mr. Sicko and Mr. Dunford, I can't, it's kind of funny to say this, but that's what the first audience would see, you would hear, Mr. Sicko and Mr. Dunford. And they die. It's no surprise. Their names were kind of implying that something bad was going to happen to them eventually. And from a family that was just running from a famine to seek for a better life, now we see the story is the story of 3 widows, an older widow and 2 young widows, which is quite shocking for the ancient world. The story becomes the story of 3 widows, and Naomi is left without sons or a husband. Now, in the ancient Near East, to an older woman, this is like losing both legs and one arm without a social safety net. It's almost a death sentence. And in fact, some of the antique cultures, this sounds horrible, but it's the truth. Once a married woman, her husband would pass away, a lot of times the remaining people, they would take the widow and throw her into the grave alive, right? That's what they would do. Because in the ancient world, the woman was worth nothing if her husband were not alive. It's horrible, but these were the ancient practices. And you've got to think that Naomi was thinking something like that. I am as good as dead at this point. I'm just surrounded by death, and I am done myself. So with that said, let's read verses 6 forward, and it says as follows. Then she, and this is talking about Naomi, she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the land of Moab, because she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find a place of rest, each one in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they raised their voices and wept. However, they said to her, "No, but we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I were even to have a husband tonight and also give birth to sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is much more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has come out against me." And they raised their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, do not plead with me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and worse, if anything but death separates me from you. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her about it. So pretty intense, right? Pretty intense back and forth in this section. Let's go into details. So verses 6 and 7, Naomi hears that there's food in her own country. They had gone away from their home country because of a famine. And by some means, she finds out that things have turned in her home country. So she starts to return. And here it uses the Hebrew shuv, the Hebrew term shuv, with her daughters-in-law. Now, I'm going to come back to that term in a little bit, but the family has shown twice that it is driven and motivated by an urge to seek its own well-being rather than trusting God's provision. And ironically, it hasn't survived so far. It was the reason they ran away from the initial state was because they were not comfortable. Things were tight. And now they run away and they're in Moab with Naomi's with two Moabite girls that have lost their husbands. But she says, I've got to return back because now there's food over there. So they're driven by their motivation, their need, rather than by God's direction. Naomi hears that the Lord has visited her homeland, suggesting that her spiritual allegiance did not shift to the gods of Moab. So that's a positive part of the story, is that she's living in a land of other gods, but she says, the Lord has visited my people, which shows that she had not yet contaminated, at least not fully. Her faith had not been contaminated. So then it says that she shuvs, or returns to her land. She turns back. Now, this is a word repeated many times in this chapter, which is a clue from the author that this word is a key to understand what is actually happening here. Shuv is also a word used in Hebrew to mean repent. Quite literally throughout the Bible, the concept of repentance isn't just, oh, I feel bad about my sin. I feel horrible about doing this. It quite literally means turning away, 180 degrees, walking in a different direction. And this is what we see. Shuv, she is literally turning back, but there is a foreshadow of the spiritual lesson that we are to learn from here. So verses 8 to 10, Naomi instructs her daughters-in-law to return home and blesses them and kisses them. She says, here we part. You have nothing to do by following me right now. But both Orpah and Naomi weep and object, or both Orpah and Ruth, I think the notes should say Orpah and Ruth weep and object. In the blessing, the key word of the book of Ruth is introduced, chesed. Let's all repeat that word so we can familiarize with it. Chesed. Chesed. And as you remember from last week, chesed, the meaning of chesed, there's not one word in English that captures the full meaning of that term, but it's something like loving loyalty, right? It's a love that inspires and motivates actions that represent deep loyalty. So, when it says that they have shown chesed to Naomi, so Naomi wants God to show the same chesed to them as they return back to their people. Naomi's motivation isn't a motivation of disgracing these young girls more, all the contrary. She wants the Lord to provide chesed, love, favor upon these two girls. Now, Let me see, I got a little bit lost here. Okay, so both daughters-in-law weep and object, not wanting to leave Naomi to her fate. 3 widows trying to make their way in these wild lands is bad enough. But an old woman traveling alone, they offer to shove along with her. So they go out in the way of an intense desire not to leave Naomi alone. Naomi intends to walk this whole journey back home alone, and they say no. Don't ask us to do that. But then verses 11 to 14, Naomi goes into an argument, an ironclad case for her daughters-in-law to return to their people. Now, Orpah and Ruth's loyalty to Naomi was based on the fact that they were married to Naomi's sons. She is too old to have more sons. And even if she did, would they wait until the sons were old enough to marry? It's ridiculous. She is claiming that the whole case for them, for these 2 young girls to be with her, is because of her sons. She also kind of implies that Yahweh has it out for Naomi. In other words, she is conveying the idea that Naomi is under judgment from Yahweh. So why would Orpah and Ruth want to be collateral damage? Why would they want to be under the same roof as Naomi when everything Naomi is seeing is disaster, is death? So then Orpah eventually leaves, but Ruth clings to her. And the word cling is a Hebrew word used multiple times in Deuteronomy to instruct how God's people should cling to the Lord, to God's commands, to his law, to his word. And this is one of many hyperlinks to Deuteronomy that we can find in the book of Ruth. This is intentional. As everything in the Bible, nothing is by accident. The Holy Spirit is writing with his finger very intentional details so that we may pay attention to them. It's intentional, and we'll see in a bit why this clinging was so important. So then in verses 15 to 18, Naomi insists again that Ruth return to her people, and she adds to that, return to your people and to your gods. Just to remind you, these 2 young ladies are Moabites. They have their own gods. They are gods that are different from the God of Israel. So Naomi seems to have lost a little bit of the faith, right? She's saying, well, my God is just pouring judgment upon me. Why don't you guys return to your gods? Probably there's something better to happen with you if you go ahead and do that. So Ruth, in response, she pledges her loyalty to Naomi and her God. In other words, the God of the Israelites. And it's interesting because it sounds like at this point, Ruth had received instruction of who that God was, right? Through her husband or through their culture. She understood who that God was, and she identifies that God very clearly. So then Naomi drops the whole argument and abandons any further effort at persuading Ruth to go off her own way. So in this passage, Naomi is kind of offering a fruit of temptation to Ruth, to go back to your gods, to abandon everything you learned about my God, the God of the Israelites, go back to your idolatry, go back to your people, go back to your culture. And also that she should abandon the poverty and the shame that will undoubtedly accompany her continued allegiance to Naomi and her God, Yahweh, but instead return to her allegiance to the Moabite people and the Moabite gods, the culture, and the way of life. But Ruth's response, she doubles down on her chesed, on her loyalty to Naomi. Again, her husband was not in the picture anymore. So she had all the reason. The passage does not condemn Orpah in any way, because the fact of the matter is that she was widowed. She owed nothing to Naomi. So Orpah left, and that sounds like what Naomi was asking her to do. But Ruth doubled down on her allegiance to Naomi, her allegiance to her specifically as a person, as a figurehead in this family. And Ruth offers a powerful pledge made with elegant chiastic poetry. It's no surprise that there's a chiasm in her poetry, in her allegiance, her claim of loyalty to Naomi. And I'll read it again. It says, "Do not plead with me to leave you, to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and worse, if anything from death separates me from you." So as you can see, the A lines that kind of bookend this chiasm, do not plead with me to leave you, and it's contrasted with the death, anything but death separates me from you. So that idea of leaving, separating. And then the B lines say, I will go, I will sleep, I will die, I will buried. This is this pledge of allegiance to wherever Naomi goes, Ruth will also go. And then the pivot line in this whole claim is, your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. So she's pretty determined that wherever Naomi goes and wherever faith she follows is the faith that Ruth will follow. Now, the line in this second B line where it says, where you die, I will die, calls your attention because it is certainly a lifelong commitment. It's, Naomi, wherever you go and rest your head, that's where I am going to be. I'm going to be with you till the very end. So it's a pretty strong commitment that Ruth is expressing through these words. The central focus of the chiasm is a pledge to follow Yahweh and identify with his chosen people. Think about Ruth. She is pledging not only to follow Naomi, but to abandon anything that she grew up with at this point. She was a Moabite. She married this Israelite man in her land. And she's saying, I am going to abandon everything. I am going to abandon everything that I was taught. My gods, the things that my people had taught was the path to righteousness or to be a good civilian or whatever. I'm going to abandon all that and I'm going to walk with you, right? Now, in the face of evidence, that's a pretty bold statement to take because Naomi had followed her God, but everything that happened was death and destruction. So it seems like a pretty pure allegiance from the point of view of Ruth, not based on any favors or any riches or any promise of well-being at all, but for the mere fact of this chesed, this loyalty, this loving, graceful loyalty. And Ruth's stunning pledge leaves Naomi speechless. She has nothing to say at this point. So the commentator James McKeown, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, says as follows: Jewish tradition draws attention to the fact that Naomi tried to dissuade Ruth 3 times, and then she realized that she had fulfilled her responsibility. Ruth's determination was shown by her persistence. She had ample opportunity to change her mind. If after 3 times Ruth still insisted, then this was proof of her resolve. This significance of 3 refusals was adopted by Jewish thought in relation to proselytes. This is explained in the Midrash. It says, 3 times it is written here, turn back, corresponding to the 3 times that a would-be proselyte is repulsed. But if he persists after that, he is accepted. This comment reflects the idea that the repeated refusal would test the sincerity of the would-be proselyte. Now, Jesus used a similar technique when he asked Peter 3 times if he loved him. By asking Peter to repeat his loyalty 3 times, Jesus was testing his resolve and also reminding him of his 3-fold denial. And we see that in the Gospel according to John, chapter 21, verses 15 to 19. So that 3 time, that insistence is by design. It's If she doesn't leave after 3 times of Naomi insisting, Ruth, go back to your people, go back to your gods, and she's still there, then it must be a matter of sincerity on her part. So let's go through the very last act in our chapter, and it says, verse 19. So they both went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. All right, so in verse 19, what we see there is they arrive back at Bethlehem. Now, you should remember, we saw this last week, that Bethlehem means Beth, the house, and Lechem, bread, the house of bread, right? Which was quite ironic at the beginning of the chapter because it was a house of bread devoid of bread. They were going through a famine. But as we saw, things have turned, right? Now they have food, they have production, and everything is good. But when Naomi arrives, it causes great commotion, and people ask, is this Naomi? Which leads us to kind of infer that Naomi and probably Elimelech, her husband, enjoyed a sense of reputation and popularity, probably because he was a landowner, probably because he had possessions. People knew this couple. So when she comes back, and remember, at least 10 years had transpired since they left. So, she might have gotten older. She might have gotten a little bit different. So people ask, is this Naomi? So this is one of 5 who is this questions strategically placed in this narrative across the whole book of Ruth. In this, the first, the women of Israel ask the identity of a woman who looks different with the passing of years. Later on in chapter 2, verse 5, we see Boaz, who wants to know the identity of the foreigner that is gleaning in his field. In chapter 2, verse 19, the central occurrence leading to Naomi's scheme, Naomi wants to know whose field Ruth so successfully gleaned from. Then in 3:9, Boaz asks who is lying at his feet. And then in 3:16, Naomi asks who is coming to the house. We're definitely getting ahead of ourselves in our narrative, but we just wanted you to see how this, who is this, is a key question that kind of comes up again and again in different contexts, but is a kind of a symbol that kind of repeats itself in this narrative. Then verses 20 to 22, Naomi answers their question. Is this Naomi? With a name change, a little bit of a plot twist here, because Naomi, as you remember, means literally the Hebrew word for sweet. But she says, don't call me sweet. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Don't call me sweet, call me bitter. And then she blames this bitterness on the hand of the Lord, the hand of Yahweh. Now, in this passage, you don't have this in your notes, but when she mentions, call me Mara, it says, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. When she says the Almighty, she uses the Hebrew term for God, El Shaddai. El Shaddai was the term, the patriarchal term for God that was used by Abraham, by Isaac, by Jacob. It was the primary way to refer to God all the way until the burning bush in front of Moses, and God reveals, I am that I am, or Yahweh is what you should call me by. But before that, it was El Shaddai. So it was a name that conveyed a lot of tradition, a deep roots in the Abrahamic covenant. So that's what she says. It's the Almighty, it's El Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. So going back to our notes here, they arrive at the time of barley harvest. So the sweet to bitter is an inverse allusion to Exodus 15, 22, 27, when the Israelites are complaining to God that the only water they had was Mara water, bitter water, right? And then when a tree was cast into the waters, they became sweet. Instead of the Almighty making the bitter to sweet, as in the Exodus story, Naomi is accusing El Shaddai of making a sweet life, a sweet family life, making it bitter. So you see that inversion, that contrast. Don't call me sweetness, as in that story from Exodus, where God is turning bitterness to sweetness. She's saying, my testimony is the opposite. I was sweet. I had a family. But now bitterness is everything for me. And it's not so, as you'll see. Obviously, you can see in the rest of the story. But this is her deep feeling. She feels it, that it's necessary for her to change her moniker, her name. So then she says that she left, and this is referring to when she left her land of origin. She left full, but returns empty. So she left full, meaning full. She has a family, she has happiness, stability, but she's returning empty. Obviously, family in the ancient world was your promise of generational legacy. It was something that people looked forward to, as in today. But at that point, having your family, your children, etc., was something you looked forward to. It gave meaning to your life. And then she said, "I left full, but I return empty." She's saying quite literally, "I've returned empty-handed with nothing." But it's funny enough because she's returning with Ruth, right? But at the same time, she's saying, I've returned empty. So this is the mental state, the emotional state of despair that Naomi is in right now. Even though Ruth has pleaded loyalty, love until the day she dies, she says, I have nothing. I have returned with nothing. But was this because of after 10 years of marriage, Ruth had no children? These are just some questions to ponder. Had Ruth had children of her sons, would she had said, I at least have this hope that I have a generational continuance. So it leaves you kind of that question to ponder. But to Naomi, Ruth is a barren woman and a widow, hardly worthy of note. It's just a question that we have to ponder. And then it says that they returned at the beginning of barley harvest. This is significant because the only hope Naomi had for funds was in land still owned by Elimelech, right? She was going back to the lands, her deceased husband. But it very well may have been that for them departing the land and abandoning that, somebody took those lands and took it to a different use. So waiting for Elimelech's return, but it's left to wonder whether Naomi had any claim upon that land, right? Common in such situations at the time was that somebody would take possession of the land and say, okay, you go, and when you come back, we'll turn it back to you. So it leaves you kind of that cliffhanger moment on what's going to happen. Does Naomi even count on going back to any type of sustenance at this point? Naomi was forbidden by custom from selling the land until the harvest was complete. And it's, she's coming empty-handed. She has to wait until the harvest ends. And there was a high chance that she could have died just waiting for this harvest of barley to be completed. Carolyn Custis James, in a commentary called The Gospel of Ruth, Loving God Enough to Break the Rules, says the following: Ruth and Naomi embody two figures cited frequently on the biblical landscape: the widow and the barren woman. Widowhood and barrenness account for some of the greatest sufferings of the women of the Bible. A deeper understanding of both is crucial to unlocking the meaning of the book of Ruth. What we seem to overlook, however, is the fact that widowhood and barrenness are more than just plot elements. They are rich and powerful theological themes that run through Scripture and which, when unearthed, reveal God's amazing heart for women and the power of what He is doing in our lives today. In the following 2 chapters, the widow and the childless woman become our teachers, bringing us a vital message that the church has often overlooked. So that's a nice little cliffhanger for the rest of the book, but also for the rest of the Bible. Because as the quote very well says, we see those themes of widowhood and barrenness. We certainly have seen it up to this point in the Bible, but we see it also in the prophetic writings as well, using those as symbol of great suffering, but also of the hope that waits for the people of God after that. So that leads us to answer or to ask ourselves, what do you think the original readers of Ruth would have thought about this whole Act 1? What would they have thought? Well, a few thoughts real quickly. Number one, the law of just recompense. And by this, we mean, whatever you do, you're going to get payment for that. You're going to get your consequences for what you do in this life. And it seems to be the undertone of this whole narrative. In this culture and as a guideline in Scripture, evil actions would result in traumatic consequences. You get what you deserve. And the first chapter would seem to support that idea. Secondly, the loyalty of Ruth would be very confusing to the very first readers. Very confusing, very surprising, and people would say, why? Like, why would a Moabite do this, right? Moabites were not supposed to act with chesed. Moabites were seductive and deceiving, right? Was Ruth's pledge a lie? And does she plan to deceive them all and be a traitor against Naomi? That's what the original audience would have thought by reading this. And then finally, Naomi's accusation of Yahweh would be seen as completely out of bounds. How dare you accuse El Shaddai? How dare you accuse Yahweh of the bitterness that you're going through, right? As seen through the lens of a legalistic interpretation of the law, Naomi deserved what she was getting. Kind of like in the book of Job, you remember Job, the friends of Job, when they ask him, Job, you did something to deserve whatever you're going through. You did something. You got to examine your heart. Like, that's how people thought in a legalistic manner. They were thinking, Naomi must have done something to deserve everything that's happening to her right now. So that's basically what they would have seen or would have interpreted. But then finally, how do we reflect on Act 1? Well, when things go terribly wrong in life, God is an easy target, right? It's the fact we see that in our day. Since He is all-powerful, He's El Shaddai, the Almighty, surely He could have prevented our pain. The book of Ruth fully acknowledges this dynamic. And then finally, it's also easy to impart stereotypes on who will show godly characteristics and who will not. Ethnically, Ruth is from the bad people, right? The bad guys in the story. She's from the worst people possible. But yet, she's the only one that is exhibiting God's character, God's attribute of loyal, loving, kindness, steadfast, graceful love. She's the only one in the whole story that is showing God's heart in this whole situation. The chesed that so many times we're talking about. So with that said, we're going to go right into our workshop. Let's give a hand to our distinguished students here at our table. And let's hear some comments, thoughts, what stirred your mind throughout this whole first chapter.
I was thinking about Ruth when she came back with Naomi. That had to be awful hard because the Israelites were hard on the Moabites, right? So would she even be, how that was a brave move to do that.
Yes.
Really harshly. And the other thing I was questioning is they were there for 10 years, Naomi, and that she had nothing from that time. It says nothing in the Bible, but
Yeah.
I wonder, was there anything,
You mean in terms of wealth or anything? Yeah. I mean, they were immigrants for 10 years, and it sounds from the text that they ran away without expecting anything. They were living as immigrants, and it seems like they had nothing left. Yes, yes, yes.
And Ruth seems to me almost like a picture of true salvation. Because she's a Moabite, right? She's young, she could have another husband, she could go her own way the way she's always gone.
Yes.
And turning from that and going to a completely foreign new life with nothing but faith, and that being enough, right? She clung onto something that was new.
Yes.
Like a story of salvation.
A leap of faith, yes.
Right, because she was in her own land, like you said.
Yes.
It was easy for her to stay, but she couldn't. So
Yes.
it's kind of like when God opens up your eyes. You just can't be the same anymore.
Yes, 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 yes. And that was a great thought. And I'll add to that it's similar in the sense that what Ruth did was totally not based on what she was going to gain from it, right? It's not based on, I'm going to do this because I'm going to get something back. On the contrary, it's, you might go through even more loss, but I'm going to be there. I'm going to follow this God. I'm going to follow your people. And it very well relates to our story of salvation. When we come to the Lord, we're not coming because we're going to get some great gain out of it. We're coming because we're dying to ourselves. We're taking on our cross. Say that in the microphones.
Because you've seen the truth.
Yes.
And you know it's truth, and you know it's not true, and you can't unsee it.
Yes, yes. Very well said. Love that comment.
Thinking about, I knew the Moabites weren't godly, but just hearing that they were just from this terrible group of people. And I know every time I've read this book, I get really choked up every time I read that when she says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, nothing will separate us. And I always think, wow, how blessed to have a friend like that or a person like that in your life. It's just, It's rare.
Yes.
And the fact, I never thought about this, that she's really the only one that exhibits love, God's love.
Yes.
That was really powerful for me because she would have been the least likely one.
Yes.
And I remember years ago I studied the genealogy, in Matthew of Jesus, and she's mentioned.
Yes.
And it's so cool because a lot of times women weren't mentioned.
Yes.
But also that God accepts anyone. And I just love that. It's the grace of God.
Yes. Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, there are 3 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. 1 a prostitute, 1 a adulteress, and 1 a Moabite. Wow. Is that not a picture of God's grace? Wow.
Well, it's completely anti-cultural. It's completely anti-cultural, right? Because women were second-class citizens at best.
Yeah,
right?
in a very patriarchal society.
Right, very patriarchal. Not being able to bear children, that was your primary contribution to society. And if you could not do that, then, you were worth nothing.
Yes.
And we see it over and over again with Hannah and with Sarah and, and Leah and Rachel.
Yes.
And so when he does that, and he says not only women, but, not only these women, but women who were in sin, I still see their value.
Yes.
At the same as every other person in sin, men and women equally.
Yes,
Which is
yes,
so
yes.
God.
Yes, absolutely.
And I love how God's grace just overtook, not Naomi, but Ruth, yes. And she was a Gentile.
Yes.
Right?
A non-Jew,
She
yeah.
was a Gentile. So
Not only that, let me just add to that she might have been very new to even knowing about the God of the Israelites. Like this was something that maybe she barely knew about, So, yeah.
right. So that was like, that's God reaching out,
Yes.
to all of us anytime.
Yes.
But struck me.
Yes, that's fantastic. Yep.
I think the other thing too that's interesting, just looking at like the context of when this was written, a lot of times the relationship between people and gods in general was very contractual. So most often someone would believe in a god simply for what they gained, or they believed that the gods also would serve the people for something that they gained, either whether it's like adoration or whatever. But here, what we see through Ruth, because Ruth is kind of like a telling of Christ's character, but also God's character too, is that the relationship that God has with people is not contractual, that he will actually go and get into the deepest part of us, the worst part of us, even though he may not gain something from us, but his desire is literally just to have us back to the one-on-one relationship that we had in Eden. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's amazing. Good stuff. Love that.
So, I mean, I can appreciate Ruth and her loyalty. That's a big deal. But I looked at this story just from a different perspective, maybe just because from a man's perspective. And I look at Elimelech, and you have a name that literally means, my God is king, and your actions were direct opposite of what your name should have driven you towards.
Yes.
And then to name your children something that
Yeah.
essentially is death.
Yes. Yeah.
So it just speaks to me that the power of the husband and the decisions that he makes, especially when names had a lot of meaning
Yes.
back then to the Jewish people, and to basically act in direct opposite of what your name means, and to
Yes.
speak death over your own lineage. It's no surprise that his family was destroyed,
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially. And so as a man and one who leads a family and the head of the house, it's just drives the point home that when you don't walk away from God's provision, you don't go outside of what you were called to do,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's death.
Yeah.
And it just it shows the gravity or the weight on a family. When you make decisions, it doesn't just impact you, it impacts everyone in the family, who
Yes.
you lead, your children, your legacy,
Yes.
for generations. Like his generation stopped at the death of his kids.
It's upped. Yeah.
So it was just a different
Great point.
perspective.
And just to tag on that, also show how God can cover, right? In a very sinful situation, God covered Naomi and
Yes.
brought her through it, and then did give her a lineage, in the lineage.
Right. Right. Yes. Yes. The grace that goes beyond the consequences, like as we read that at the end, that ancient legalistic culture was like, you get what you get your due. Eventually you're going to get it, whatever you do. And you see God's hand saying, nope, not going to give you what you deserve, or whatever you did, I'm going to fulfill my will. This is so beautiful. Yeah. Great thoughts. Isn't that amazing? Great thoughts. I'll give it one more hand. And I think that we have time for a few questions. So yeah.
Hello? Okay. You ready, Pastor Alex?
I want to think so.
All right. There was one written in one, actually.
Oh, very cool.
Do we know who wrote the book of Ruth, and do we know when it was written?
Yeah, the text doesn't say it, and there have been speculations, but it's really not worth exposing them, because we can't really affirm that there was a writer. We know that the Holy Spirit finger ultimately wrote the book. I mean, it's inspired the book of Ruth, because it is among the inspired sacred text. And I don't recall at this point when it was, but to place it in time, it must have been after the time of David, for reasons that we'll see later on. Not to spoil the story, but you probably know it.
And can Hesed be compared to or be a reflection of God's unconditional agape love?
Yes, there definitely are some parallels. Now, agape is a Greek term, and oftentimes Greek terms and Hebrew terms don't have a direct translation either. But if we go with the popular notion of what agape love is, which is that unconditional, deep, godly love, then yes, there is some crossover to chesed, but chesed conveys this dimension of loyalty that I don't think agape by itself expresses personally, but yeah, chesed does have that, I'm going to cling to you wherever you go.
Okay. Is there any connection between the bitterness we see in Naomi's walk into Bethlehem and the final days of Jesus, where he's given such bitterness on his way to the cross?
That's an interesting parallel. I can't see it, but it's a compelling thought. Certainly, the most obvious connection is that bitterness is a human emotion. And it's a human emotion that is a response to situations. However, in Jesus' case, Jesus did not reflect the bitterness that the Bible tells us to guard our hearts against. That's not what Jesus was feeling. Jesus was feeling physical pain, the weight of our sin, all of these things, but his heart was not bitter. His heart was hopeful. And I think there's a verse in Hebrews that says that Jesus, for the joy that he looked forward to, he went through every year. I can't recall it by memory, and I'm horrible remembering verses in English, at least. In Spanish, I probably could, but that's no use to you. But Jesus went through what he went through in joy. He felt physical pain. He felt, humiliation, but he still had joy. He looked forward to his what he was doing for the Father's glory and for our redemption. So in that sense, I think they don't have any association with each other. Where they do cross over is just a normal human emotion, a response. But the Bible does tell us to guard our hearts against bitterness, for sure.
And this last one, I'll try to combine a couple. There were a couple questions about Moabite women. So the original question was when did they become, at what point in the Bible did Moabite women become inferior to others? And then are you able to expand at all on how a Moabite woman would have lived in Israel? What would have been what would she be facing? Yeah,
so there are actually two dimensions here. One is the Moabite as a people, as a tribe. And as we saw way back in the Torah, we're seeing the Moabites being expressed and conveyed as a people of following false gods and people that had horrible practices and whatnot. So that's dimension number one. And then dimension number two, as you were saying on the table, is a woman, which not from the law of God, because the law of God preserved the value of women and everything, as you know. But in the ancient world, a woman was a second-class human, a second-class citizen. So she had those two things working against her. Right? And then the final part of your question was, how would a Moabite woman look like living in the land of Israel, in Bethlehem? You can just imagine. She's not only a barren, widowed woman, but she's also an immigrant. She also doesn't belong here. She probably looked different than everybody else. So she had everything going against her, which I think is part of the beauty of the story, and what happens later on is that she is the one that's displaying God's character and upon whom God's grace is being poured onto. So I think it's amazing. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you were edified through this class. God bless you, and I will see you next week.